Close your eyes for a moment and picture the surface of the sea at dusk. The light is fading, turning from gold to a deep, quiet blue. Somewhere below that surface, in a world without wind or sound as we know it, a creature is waking up. Soft-bodied, endlessly curious, older in its lineage than the dinosaurs. Tonight, we are going to follow her. We'll call her simply the Octopus. Not because she needs a name, but because for the next hour, she will be our guide into one of the strangest, gentlest, most quietly astonishing lives on Earth. Let's begin our descent. As we sink beneath the waves, the light softens further, and the water presses in around us like a blanket. This is her world. And to survive in it, her body has had to become something almost unrecognizable to us. Consider, for a moment, her heart. Or rather her hearts. She doesn't have just one, as we do. She has three. Two small hearts sit near her gills, working quietly to push blood through them, gathering oxygen from the water. And one larger heart, at her center, sends that oxygen-rich blood on its journey through the rest of her body. It's a strange kind of rhythm, three hearts beating in their own soft sequence, keeping her alive in the cold and the dark. And if you could see that blood, you'd notice something else unusual. It isn't red, the way ours is. It's blue. A pale, ghostly blue, tinted by a copper-based molecule called hemocyanin, rather than the iron-based hemoglobin that colors our own blood red. Out here, in cold water low in oxygen, that blue blood works quietly and efficiently, carrying what little oxygen there is to where it's needed most. 3 hearts. Blue blood. And we've barely begun. Let's drift a little deeper, past the swaying kelp, past the pale coral, into the soft sand where she makes her home. Watch her arms as she moves. 8 of them, rippling like ribbons in slow water, each one seeming to know exactly where to go, exactly what to do, almost without her thinking about it at all. That's because, in a way, she isn't thinking about it. Not entirely with her central mind. She has a brain in her head, yes, small and folded, tucked between her eyes. But she also has a smaller cluster of nerves in each of her 8 arms. 9 brains in total, each arm working with a certain quiet independence, tasting, reaching, deciding, even while the rest of her attention rests elsewhere. It means that if you asked her arm a simple question, in its own small way it might already know the answer before she does. Let her arms drift across the sand now, and something wonderful happens. She doesn't just touch the world around her. She tastes it. Every one of the hundreds of suckers lining her arms is lined with chemoreceptors, tiny sensors that let her taste whatever she touches, seawater, sand, the shell of a hidden crab, simply by brushing against it. Her whole body, in a sense, is a tongue reaching out into the dark to taste the shape of the world. And as she moves across a bed of pink coral, watch closely, because something else begins to happen. Her skin begins to change. It ripples first with a faint blush of rose, then deepens, matching the coral almost perfectly, texture and all, tiny bumps rising along her skin to mimic the coral's rough surface. This is thanks to thousands of specialized cells called chromatophores, tiny sacs of pigment she can expand and contract in an instant, alongside muscles that let her change her very texture, smooth to rough, in the space of a breath. She isn't hiding, exactly. She's simply becoming part of the reef. Disappearing into it the way a shadow disappears into evening. Now watch what happens as a narrow gap opens in the rocks ahead, barely wider than a coin. She doesn't hesitate. She pours herself into it. Because she has no bones. Not one, anywhere in her body, except for a small hardened beak at the very center of her arms, used only for feeding. Everything else about her is soft, flexible, boneless muscle, which means that if her beak can fit through a space the rest of her can follow, flowing through like water finding its way downhill. It's a small miracle of a body. No rigid shape to hold her back. Only softness, and the sea, and wherever she chooses to go. Further down, along a shallow stretch of open sand, we find something surprising resting near her den. A cluster of broken coconut shells, and the halves of an old, hollow shellfish, carried here, arranged carefully, almost deliberately. Some of her cousins, other octopus species living in warmer waters, have been observed doing something remarkable, carrying shells like these across the sea floor, sometimes for quite some distance, to use later as portable armor, a shelter they can close themselves inside of when danger comes near. It's a simple kind of foresight. A tool, kept for later. And it's one of the quiet clues that has made scientists look at these soft, boneless creatures and wonder just how much is happening in that small folded brain of hers, and in the 9 minds spread through her body. As the current shifts and carries us gently onward, we pass a hollow beneath a ledge of stone, where another octopus, older, paler, more still, rests over a cluster of pale, glistening eggs. She hasn't left this spot in weeks. She won't eat again. Her only task now, the only thing left in her life, is to guard these eggs, gently stroking them with her arms to keep them clean and aerated, until, one quiet day, they finally hatch and drift away into the open sea. And when they do, her long watch will be over. It's a strange and tender kind of ending, one final act of care, given so completely that nothing is kept back. We won't dwell here too long. Only enough to notice it, and to carry it gently with us as we continue on. Our octopus, our quiet guide for tonight, drifts on ahead of us now, her eyes catching what little light remains above. Her eyes are large, well-formed, remarkably good at gathering light in these dim waters, though curiously, she may not see the world in color at all, at least not with those eyes alone. And yet, somehow, she matches color perfectly when she hides. Some who study her wonder if her skin itself, scattered with light-sensitive cells, might let her sense color in some other way, tasting light, almost, the way she tastes the sand. It's one of the small mysteries she carries with her. One of many we may never fully unravel. For now, let's simply follow her a little further into the blue, breathing slowly, letting the current carry us as we continue, into the next part of her world. We drift onward now, following her through a stretch of open water where the current runs a little stronger, and the sand below gives way to scattered stone. Something moves in the shadows nearby, quick and low, and for a moment our octopus tenses. It's only a passing fish, nothing more, but her body has already answered the question before her mind fully catches up. A soft cloud blooms from a spot near her siphon, dark as spilled ink against the pale water, spreading into a loose shape that almost seems to hold her form. She isn't just hiding behind that cloud. The ink itself carries a compound that dulls a predator's sense of smell, along with a dark curtain of pigment, buying her a few precious seconds to slip quietly away while the confusion settles. By the time the water clears, she's already gone. She moves now the way only she can, drawing water into the wide dome of her body and pushing it out again through a narrow siphon near her side, sending herself gliding backward in a smooth, silent burst. It's a simple kind of jet propulsion, water in, water out, and yet it carries her faster and farther than her soft, gentle drifting ever could. For a creature with no bones and no fins, it's a remarkably elegant way to fly. Let her settle again, resting now on a bed of pale gravel, and turn our attention back to her arms, because there's more to understand about how she moves through the world. We spoke earlier of the small clusters of nerves within each arm, but the scale of it is worth pausing on. Roughly 2 out of every 3 neurons in her entire body live not in her head, but scattered through her 8 arms. It means each arm can taste, reach, and respond with a kind of local wisdom of its own, coordinating with the rest of her, but never entirely dependent on instruction from above. It's less like a limb obeying a command, and more like 8 quiet collaborators, each fluent in the same language, each trusted to think for itself when it matters. Watch one of those arms now, reaching along a crevice in the stone. Look closely at the pale row of suckers lining its underside, hundreds of them, each one its own small muscle, capable of gripping with startling strength, independent of the others, able to hold fast to stone or shell even while the rest of the arm continues its slow, searching movement elsewhere. It's this quiet, distributed strength that lets her pry open a stubborn shell, or anchor herself firmly against a passing current, without ever needing to think about each grip individually. There, near the base of one arm, a faint scar catches the fading light, smaller and paler than the arm around it. Some time ago, this arm was lost, taken by a hungry predator or torn free in an escape. But it grew back. Slowly, patiently, over the months that followed, nerve and muscle and skin knitting themselves anew, until the arm was whole again, indistinguishable from the rest. It's a quiet kind of resilience, the kind that asks for no attention and simply, patiently, repairs itself in the dark. Let's follow her now toward a stretch of open ocean floor, scattered with old debris, a broken bottle, some scattered stones, and here, scientists studying her kind have found something remarkable. Given a sealed jar with a crab inside, some octopuses will work at the lid patiently, twisting and pressing, until it gives way. Others, placed in mazes or unfamiliar enclosures, have found their way out entirely on their own, remembering the path on a second attempt. It's a curious kind of quiet genius, tested not through language or expression, the way we might test our own, but through patience, memory, and the slow, careful work of her many small minds working as one. And yet, for all of that intelligence, her time in this world is brief. Most octopuses live for only a year, perhaps two, from the moment they hatch to the moment their life quietly ends. It's a short span for a creature capable of so much, solving puzzles, remembering paths, changing her very shape and color at will. Perhaps it simply means she has no time to waste. Every moment lived fully, without the luxury of years to spare. She lives, too, mostly alone. Unlike so many creatures of the reef who travel in schools or shelter in groups, she keeps her own quiet company, claiming a small den as entirely her own, and encountering others of her kind only rarely, usually only when it's time to mate. It isn't loneliness, exactly. It's simply her nature. A solitary life, lived fully within the boundaries of herself. As we drift past a patch of pale, sandy floor, something strange unfolds ahead of us. A shape rises from the sand, flattens itself, and begins to undulate away, moving with the unmistakable grace of a venomous sea snake, black and white bands rippling down its length. But it isn't a snake at all. It's a cousin of our guide, a mimic octopus, capable of studying the shapes of other creatures in her waters, and briefly becoming them, flattening her body to imitate a poisonous flatfish, or trailing two arms behind her to mimic a snake's banded warning, borrowing the fear that other creatures inspire, simply by wearing their shape for a moment. It's one more quiet reminder of just how much lives inside these soft, boneless bodies. Not just the ability to hide, but the ability to become something else entirely, if only for as long as it takes to stay safe. Our octopus settles now into a hollow beneath a wide, flat stone, drawing her arms in close around her, resting as the water grows darker still around us. Let's rest here with her for a moment, breathing slowly, before we continue further into her world. The water has grown darker now, the last traces of surface light fading into a deep, quiet blue, and our octopus has settled fully into rest, tucked beneath her stone, her arms curled gently around her. Watch her skin as she sleeps, because something remarkable is happening. Faint waves of color pass across her, a soft blush of gold, a ripple of deep violet, patterns rising and fading without any predator nearby to hide from, any surface to match. Some who study her kind believe this may be something like a dream, her sleeping mind rehearsing the colors and patterns of her waking hours, drifting through some quiet inner reef of her own. We may never know exactly what she experiences in that stillness. But it's a gentle thought to hold, that even in sleep, her body continues speaking its silent, colorful language. Deep within her, tucked behind each eye, sit two small fluid-filled chambers called statocysts, each one lined with tiny sensory hairs and a small grain of chalky material that shifts with gravity. They serve much the same purpose as the balance organs in our own inner ear, letting her sense up from down, and telling her, even in the total darkness of a hidden den, whether she is resting level and still. It's a small, quiet sense, rarely noticed, that keeps her steady through every current and every drifting turn. As we move on past her resting place, the water opens into a wider stretch of reef, and here, we come across another of her kind, far larger than our gentle guide. This is a giant Pacific octopus, one of the largest of all her family, capable of growing arm to arm wider than a grown man is tall, and weighing as much as a large dog, though she began life, like all octopuses, no larger than a grain of rice. She moves slowly across the reef, patient and unhurried, entirely undramatic despite her size, simply another quiet resident of these waters going about her evening. Nearby, tucked into a shallow crevice, something smaller catches a last thread of fading light, and it's worth pausing here, gently, to notice it rather than approach. Small rings of iridescent blue flicker faintly across her skin, a soft warning rather than an invitation. This is a blue-ringed octopus, no larger than a golf ball, and yet carrying within her a venom potent enough to be dangerous to nearly anything that threatens her. She has no wish to use it. The rings themselves are usually enough, a quiet, glowing sentence that simply says, "Leave me be," and in these waters, most creatures know to listen. We drift onward, respectfully, leaving her to her rest. Further along, in the deeper shadow beneath an overhang of rock, we find two of her kind together, an uncommon sight for such solitary creatures. This is a courtship, brief and careful. The male reaches toward her with one arm, different from the rest, called a hectocotylus, specially adapted to carry and pass along a small packet of sperm, reaching across the short distance between them without the need to draw any closer than necessary. It's a quiet, practical kind of intimacy, brief, purposeful, and soon, the two will part ways again, returning to their separate, solitary lives. In time, if all goes well, she will lay her eggs in some hidden den much like the one we passed before, and the number may astonish you. Some species lay only a few hundred, but others, like the giant Pacific octopus we just passed, may lay as many as 100,000 eggs in a single clutch, delicate strings of them hung like pale garlands from the roof of her den, each one no larger than a grain of rice, each one, if it survives, capable of becoming something as strange and wonderful as the mother who guards it. Let's rise now, gently, away from the reef floor, following the current upward and outward, toward the open blue where the water grows colder and the light disappears almost entirely. Here, far below where sunlight can reach, other cousins of our octopus have made their home. The Dumbo octopus drifts through this darkness, small fins near its head flapping gently like a pair of soft ears, giving it its name, hovering rather than crawling, at home in a cold, silent world thousands of feet below any reef. It's remarkable to consider that her family stretches this far, from the sunlit shallows we began in tonight, all the way down into a darkness so complete that light itself becomes a foreign idea. And perhaps this is part of what has let her family spread so widely, from icy depths to warm shallow reefs, adapting endlessly to wherever the sea has placed them. Scientists have found that octopuses possess an unusual ability to edit their own genetic instructions on the fly, adjusting certain proteins within their nervous system in response to temperature and condition, a kind of quiet, living flexibility written into her most basic biology, long before it ever shows in how she moves or hides or hunts. It seems fitting, somehow. A creature built entirely from softness and change, changing even at the smallest, quietest level of herself. We drift back down now, gently, away from the cold dark of the open water, back toward the reef, back toward our own quiet guide, still resting beneath her stone, still dreaming her slow, colorful dreams, as the night settles fully around us. The night has settled fully now, and the reef around us has grown quiet in the particular way that only the ocean can be quiet, full of small movement, small sound, and yet, somehow, entirely still. Our octopus stirs beneath her stone, the last traces of her sleeping colors fading from her skin, and she begins, slowly, to wake. Let's take a moment here, as she gathers herself, to consider just how long creatures like her have called this ocean home. Her family stretches back further than almost any other creature we might imagine sharing these waters with. Fossils of her earliest ancestors reach back some 300 million years, long before the first dinosaur ever took a step on land, long before the continents themselves had settled into the shapes we'd recognize today. She carries all of that time within her, somehow, in a body that seems so impossibly delicate, so briefly lived. A soft and ancient thread, unbroken across hundreds of millions of years. And she is far from alone in the world, even in her solitary way. Scientists have identified some 300 distinct species within her family, scattered across every ocean on Earth, from the icy waters near the poles to the warmest shallow reefs near the equator, each one shaped a little differently by the particular corner of the sea it calls home. 300 million years of history. 300 different forms, still living, still adapting, tonight, all across this one blue planet. She begins to move now, drawing herself out from beneath her stone, and as she does, look closely at her arms trailing behind her, each one lined, top to bottom, with rows of pale, circular suckers. Across all 8 arms combined, a single octopus may carry as many as 2,000 of them, each one capable of independent movement, independent grip, independent taste. 2,000 small, patient senses, reaching out together into the dark. She moves now across a stretch of open sand toward a scattering of loose rock and drifting algae, and here, something curious happens. Rather than crawling on all 8 arms as she often does, she draws 6 of them up and in against her body, curling them close, disguising their shape entirely, while the remaining 2 arms extend beneath her, and she begins, quite deliberately, to walk. It's a strange and rather charming sight, an octopus walking upright on 2 arms alone, the rest of her held close and still, resembling nothing more than a drifting clump of algae or a rolling stone, carried gently along by the current. A quiet disguise, worn simply by changing the way she chooses to move. At the center of her, hidden beneath the soft mound of her body where her arms all meet, sits the one part of her that isn't soft at all. A small, hard beak, shaped remarkably like that of a parrot, sharp enough to crack the shell of a crab or clam with a single firm bite. And within that bite, a small amount of venom, present in every one of her 300 cousins, though in most species, including our own quiet guide tonight, far too mild to trouble anything larger than the small creature she hunts. It's easy to forget, watching her drift so gently through the water, that she carries this quiet, ancient weapon within her, used sparingly, and only when it's truly needed. Look now into her eyes as she pauses atop a low ridge of stone, surveying the water ahead. Her pupils aren't round, the way ours are, but stretched into a soft, horizontal rectangle, rather like the eyes of a goat grazing in a distant field. It's a shape that lets her keep the horizon steady and level in her vision, even as her soft, boneless body tips and rolls and twists in the current, always finding true and level, no matter how the rest of her might turn. A small, elegant trick of biology, keeping her world upright, even when she herself is not. As she continues on, her skin flickers briefly with a fast, dark ripple, a band of shadow passing quickly across her body from head to arm tip, there and gone in less than a second. It's called a passing cloud display, and it isn't camouflage this time, but something closer to communication, a sudden flicker of pattern sometimes used to startle a hidden crab from its hiding place, or simply to signal unease to another octopus drifting too near. Her skin, it seems, is never entirely silent. Even alone, even in the quiet dark, it continues speaking in its own soft, wordless language. Across the world, in recent years, our understanding of just how much she might feel, and sense, and even suffer, has grown alongside our understanding of her intelligence. In 2021, after reviewing years of careful research into her nervous system and behavior, lawmakers in the United Kingdom formally recognized octopuses, along with other cephalopods, as sentient beings under the law, deserving of protection and careful, humane consideration. It's a quiet kind of acknowledgement, one that took the rest of us rather a long time to arrive at, that a creature so different from ourselves, boneless, three-hearted, nine-brained, might still hold within her something worth calling a mind, worth calling a feeling, worth our care. And unlike so many creatures who reach a certain size and simply stop growing, our octopus continues to grow steadily throughout her entire life, however brief that life may be, never quite finished, never quite complete, growing softly and quietly for as long as the sea allows her to. She settles now at the edge of the reef, resting for a moment as the current slows around her, and we rest here too, quietly, before we follow her onward into the next stretch of her world. Fully awake now, our octopus begins her slow journey across the reef, and this is, in its own quiet way, the beginning of her working night. Hunting time. The hours when she must find enough to sustain her soft, ever-growing body until the sun rises again. It's worth pausing here to remember something about her that's easy to forget, given how strange and singular she seems. For all her differences from us, she belongs to a very old and very large family we know well from gentler creatures. She is a mollusk, cousin to the garden snail and the humble clam, though evolution has taken her branch of that family somewhere entirely unexpected, shedding shell, growing arms, gathering 9 small minds into one soft and searching body. Some of her more distant cousins, the chambered nautilus among them, still carry the coiled, spiraled shell that her own ancestors likely once wore. Somewhere in her deep history, that shell was set aside, traded for speed and flexibility, and the freedom to pour herself into any hiding place the reef offered. It was, perhaps, a fair trade. A little armor lost, an entire new way of living gained. And within that soft, shell-less body sits a brain remarkably large for a creature of her kind, larger, relative to her size, than any other invertebrate on Earth. It isn't only the 9 small minds working through her arms that make her remarkable, but the fact that, among all the soft-bodied, boneless creatures of this ocean, she alone has developed something so intricate, so capable of memory and problem-solving, and perhaps even something like curiosity. As she moves across a patch of mottled stone, watch her skin once more, because there's a detail we glossed over earlier that deserves a closer look. It isn't only color that shifts across her, but texture itself. Tiny muscles beneath her skin can raise small, fleshy bumps, called papillae, transforming her smooth surface into something rough and uneven in an instant, matching not just the color of the coral beside her, but its very shape, until even a careful eye might look right past her. It's a camouflage so complete it borders on disappearance itself. She pauses now near a narrow crevice, one arm extended cautiously ahead of the rest, and here we might notice something we haven't spoken of yet tonight. Not every creature in these waters wishes her well. Murray eels hunt these same crevices, sharks patrol the open water beyond the reef, and dolphins, clever and social, have learned clever ways of coaxing an octopus from even her most stubborn hiding place. For all her soft intelligence, she remains, every night, something for other creatures to hunt. Caution isn't optional for her. It's simply part of staying alive until morning. But not every creature she meets tonight is a threat. Ahead, along the edge of a coral shelf, a small reef fish waits, hovering with a strange kind of patience, and our octopus approaches it not with caution, but with something closer to partnership. This is a coral trout, and together, the two of them will hunt. She slips into crevices too narrow for the fish to follow, flushing hidden prey out into open water, while the trout waits above, ready to catch whatever slips free. It's a rare thing in nature, two entirely different creatures working together toward the same simple goal, sharing the reward. Researchers who've watched this partnership closely have even observed her, on occasion, growing impatient with a slower partner, giving an idle fish a firm, decisive nudge to hurry it back to the work at hand. Even in partnership, it seems, she keeps her own particular way of doing things. She finds, at last, a clam wedged tightly into a crack in the rock, and here we can watch her strength at work. A single one of her many suckers, no larger than a small coin, can hold fast with a grip many times its own modest weight, and with dozens of them working together along one arm, she pries the shell loose from the stone with a slow, steady patience that no lock or hiding place can outlast for long. It's a strength you'd never guess from looking at her, soft, boneless, drifting so gently through the water only moments before. As the hunt carries her toward the reef's shallow edge, she does something that might surprise you. The water here grows thin enough that a narrow tide pool separates her from a promising stretch of exposed rock, glistening faintly with trapped water and stranded prey. Rather than turn back, she rises, briefly, from the water entirely, her arms gripping the wet stone, breathing for a few brief moments through the moisture held in her gill chamber, crossing the short, exposed gap before slipping back into the safety of the sea on the other side. It's a small, startling glimpse of just how far her adaptability reaches, comfortable enough on land, however briefly, to use it as simply one more path toward what she needs. She settles back into the water now, her hunt for the moment satisfied, and rests for a moment against a low outcrop of stone, gathering herself before the night continues on. Let's rest with her here too, for just a moment, before we follow her further into the hours still ahead. Our octopus rests a while longer against the low stone shelf, and it seems a fitting moment to pause with her, and consider, for a moment, the very word we've been using to describe her all this time. Octopus. It comes to us from ancient Greek, a simple joining of two small words, octo, meaning 8, and pous, meaning foot. 8 feet. A plain, practical name for a creature that has turned out to be anything but plain. Even the word itself has caused some quiet debate over the years, whether the proper way to speak of many of her kind is octopuses, or octopi, borrowing a Latin ending that doesn't quite belong to this Greek word, or octopods, more faithful to her Greek roots but rarely spoken outside a linguist's careful company. Most, these days, simply settle on octopuses, and perhaps that's for the best. She's complicated enough without us arguing over her grammar. She stirs again, deciding to swim a short distance rather than crawl, and here we come across something rather surprising. As she draws water in and releases it in that familiar jetting burst, her large central heart, the one at the core of her three, actually pauses its beating altogether while she swims. It's part of why she tires quickly when swimming and prefers, whenever she can, the slower, steadier work of crawling along the reef instead, resting her heart along with the rest of her. Even her hearts, it seems, take their own kind of rest, depending on how she chooses to move. As she settles once more, her skin catching the faint light in shifting waves of color, let's return briefly to those remarkable cells we spoke of earlier, and add one more layer to the picture. Beyond the countless chromatophores that shift her color from within, two further kinds of cells lie just beneath them, iridophores, which reflect and bend light like tiny mirrors, giving certain patches of her skin a shimmering, metallic quality, and leucophores, simple white reflective cells that help her mimic the palest, brightest surfaces of the reef. Together, layer upon layer, these three kinds of cells give her the full and startling range of her disguise, color, shimmer, and pure reflected light, all working in careful concert. It's worth noting, too, as she turns one large, attentive eye toward a passing shadow, that this eye, so remarkably similar in structure to our own, complete with a lens, a retina, an iris that narrows and widens, developed entirely separately from ours, along an evolutionary path that diverged from our own many hundreds of millions of years ago. Two entirely unrelated branches of life, arriving, quite independently, at nearly the same elegant solution for seeing the world. It's one of the quieter wonders of her existence, that in some ways, her eye and ours are strangers who somehow learned to speak the very same language. Let's drift now, gently, away from the shallow reef, and out toward the deep, cold water beyond its edge, because far below us, in the near-total darkness of the deep sea floor, something extraordinary has been discovered. In certain places, warmed faintly by heat rising from cracks in the ocean floor, thousands of octopuses gather together in vast numbers, clustered side by side across the cold stone, each one brooding her own eggs in the gentle warmth. Places like this have earned the quiet name of octopus gardens, one of the very few times in her life that this solitary creature chooses, however briefly, to share her space so closely with so many others of her kind. It's a strange kind of gathering, born not of friendship, but of simple shared need, warmth enough to help her eggs along, found together in the cold, dark quiet of the deep. Among her more unusual cousins, we might mention the argonaut, sometimes called the paper nautilus, though she isn't truly related to the nautilus at all. The female of this particular species uses two of her arms, wide and delicately webbed, to secrete a thin, spiraled shell of her own making, pale and beautifully fragile, not for her own body's protection, but as a floating nursery to house and carry her eggs across the open ocean. And in a few of her family's stranger corners, the difference between males and females grows almost impossible to believe. The blanket octopus, drifting through open water far from any reef, shows one of the most striking size differences in the animal kingdom, her body, trailing broad webbed sheets between her arms like a cape, growing many, many times larger than the male of her species, who may be smaller than a fingernail beside her. Some of her relatives have even been observed carrying weapons of a kind, tearing stinging tentacles from a passing jellyfish and holding them in their own arms, immune to the sting themselves, using another creature's own defenses as their own. Our octopus, small and solitary and quietly remarkable in her own right, drifts on now past the edge of the reef, and we drift with her, as the first half of this long night draws quietly to its close. Our octopus drifts on into the second half of this long, quiet night, and the current carries her, gently, toward the dark, half-buried shape of an old sunken hull, resting on the sea floor where it settled long ago, now softened at every edge by decades of coral and drifting sand. It seems a fitting place to pause, and consider for a moment just how long we, too, have been drawn to creatures like her. Nearly 2,500 years ago, a curious Greek philosopher named Aristotle spent long hours by the shore, watching creatures very much like our quiet guide, and wrote some of the very first careful, thoughtful descriptions of her behavior, her color changes, her curious habits, that we still have any record of today. Long before laboratories, before microscopes, before any of the tools we rely on now, someone simply sat, and watched, and wondered about her, much as we're doing tonight. And he wasn't the first to be captivated by her. On the island of Crete, more than 3,000 years ago, artists of the ancient Minoan civilization decorated their pottery with her image again and again, graceful, curling arms wrapped elegantly around the curved surface of a jar or vase, a favorite motif of an entire vanished culture, drawn to the same strange beauty that still catches our attention tonight. Resting here beside this old, quiet wreck, it seems worth noting that her fascination with humanity has hardly faded with time. In laboratories today, researchers study her closely, drawn to the same remarkable qualities that first caught Aristotle's eye so long ago, her ability to regrow a lost arm, her strange and distributed nervous system, her puzzle-solving mind, all offering quiet clues that may help us better understand memory and healing, and the very nature of thought itself, not just in her, but perhaps, in time, in ourselves as well. Those who've cared for her in captivity often come away with stories that sound almost like folklore. Some describe an octopus who seemed to recognize the particular footsteps or faces of certain caretakers, growing calm and curious around those she seemed to like, while turning a cool, deliberate jet of water toward a visitor she'd apparently decided she didn't care for. Whether this is memory, personality, or simply pattern and preference, no one can say for certain. But it's hard not to smile at the thought of her having opinions about us, quietly, from behind the glass. One story in particular has traveled further than most. In 2016, at a small aquarium in New Zealand, an octopus named Inky slipped out of his tank overnight through a narrow gap at its very top, made his way, arm over arm, across the floor of the aquarium in the dark, and disappeared down a drain pipe that led, at last, straight back to the sea. He was never seen again. It's tempting to imagine him settling somewhere out there tonight, in some quiet reef much like this one, having simply decided, in his own patient way, that the ocean was where he belonged. Our octopus presses one arm gently against the old, encrusted hull beside her, feeling her way along its surface, and we might return once more to those remarkable suckers lining her arms. They hold their grip not through any sticky substance, the way we might imagine, but through simple, elegant muscle, each sucker forming a tight seal against the surface and drawing its center inward, creating a small pocket of lower pressure that holds fast without ever leaving a mark behind. When she lets go, the surface beneath her is exactly as it was before she touched it. As she turns her wide, calm eye upward, toward the last faint traces of light still filtering weakly from far above, it's worth mentioning one more quiet mystery of her vision. Some of her family are able to perceive polarized light, a subtle quality of light invisible to our own eyes entirely, shifting and rippling in patterns across the water's surface, which may help her navigate these waters, or notice the faint outline of otherwise perfectly camouflaged prey hiding nearby. She sees, in her own way, a world layered with detail that we will simply never have access to. Far south of here, in the icy waters that circle the very bottom of the world, some of her more distant cousins have adapted even further, developing a special variation of that same blue, copper-rich blood we spoke of earlier, one able to keep carrying oxygen efficiently even in water cold enough to nearly freeze. It's one more quiet example of just how far her family has learned to stretch itself into every corner of this ocean, however hostile that corner might seem. And perhaps it's forgivable that, for centuries, sailors who caught only a brief, startled glimpse of a large octopus or her giant squid cousins rising from the deep, arms trailing long behind them in dark water, carried home stories of krakens, and sea monsters, and terrible things lurking just beneath their ships. It's easier to understand those old, frightened stories, now, having spent this quiet hour getting to know her instead. She settles again, resting one final moment beside the old, silent wreck, before continuing on into the last stretch of her long night and hours. The night has grown very still now, and our octopus moves slowly along the reef, unhurried, as if she too can feel how close we're drawing to the quiet hours before dawn. Let's take this calmer stretch to simply look at her, whole, and understand the shape of the body that's carried her through everything we've witnessed tonight. Above her 8 trailing arms sits a soft, rounded mantle, a kind of gentle dome, and it's here, tucked safely within, that so much of what we've spoken of tonight actually lives. Her 3 quiet hearts, her pale gills, the soft coils of her digestive organs, all held within that one soft, unassuming shape. It's easy to watch her arms, endlessly busy, endlessly expressive, and forget that the calm, rounded dome above them is quietly doing just as much work, just out of sight. Within that mantle, water is drawn in with each soft, steady pulse, passed gently over her gills where oxygen is gathered from the sea, and finally sent back out again through her siphon, the same narrow passage she uses for her swift, jetting bursts of movement. One simple structure, breath and motion both, flowing from the very same quiet rhythm. At the center of her, where her arms all gather, we spoke earlier of her small, hard beak. But it doesn't work alone. Just behind it sits a smaller, ribbon-like organ called a vula, lined with tiny, tooth-like ridges, which she uses to rasp gently through a shell once her beak has cracked it open, and here, she often adds one more careful touch, a small amount of saliva carrying soft enzymes that begin to loosen and soften the flesh within, letting her feed with patience rather than force. It's a slow, careful kind of eating, more like a quiet unwrapping than a hunt. Watch her skin once more as she passes over a bed of pale, pink anemones, and notice just how quickly her color shifts to match them, in far less than a single second, faster, in fact, than nearly any other creature alive is able to change its appearance. It's a reminder of just how much quiet, constant readiness lives within her, an entire wardrobe of color and pattern, worn and shed again in the space of a single heartbeat. Not every one of her family carries every one of these traits, though. Her deep-sea cousins, the gentle, fin-eared Dumbo octopuses we met drifting through the darkness earlier tonight, often lack an ink sac altogether. Down where she lives, in water so deep that light never reaches at all, a cloud of ink would simply vanish into darkness that's already complete, offering no advantage, no confusion to hide within. Evolution, it seems, is willing to let go of even her most iconic defenses, when a particular corner of the sea simply has no use for them. As she reaches toward a small, unfamiliar object resting on the sand ahead, an old shell, perhaps, or a smooth, rounded stone, researchers who study her closely have noticed something rather charming. She often seems to favor one particular eye, or a particular pair of arms, when investigating something new and unfamiliar, in much the same quiet way that we ourselves might favor a dominant hand. It's a small, personal detail, hinting that even among her kind, no 2 octopuses experience the world in quite the same way. Nearby, in the shadow of a low ridge, another pair of octopuses linger close together, longer than we might expect from such solitary creatures. Here, in some species, a male will stay near a female for a time after mating, a quiet kind of vigilance meant to discourage any other male from approaching her before her eggs are laid. It's not companionship, exactly, but a brief, practical closeness, born from her family's rare and careful approach to raising the next generation. Further along, where the reef gives way to the mouth of a wide, slow river meeting the sea, the water turns cloudy and uncertain, salt and fresh water blending together in a way that few ocean creatures can tolerate for long. And yet, some of her cousins make their home in exactly these places, brackish estuaries where the water's very nature shifts with the tide, one more quiet testament to just how adaptable her family has become, willing to make a home in nearly any corner of the world that offers her food and shelter and a place to rest. And perhaps this is the quietest fact of all to carry with us as her night, and ours, begins its final stretch. Across careful, patient study, researchers have come to recognize that she isn't simply reacting to the world around her, moment to moment, the way a much simpler creature might. She shows real, consistent differences from one individual to the next, some bolder, more curious, quicker to explore an unfamiliar object, others far more cautious, holding back, watching first before ever choosing to act. She is not simply an octopus tonight. She is, in her own quiet, particular way, herself. Let's rest with her a while longer here, as the reef grows quieter still, and the last hour of our long, gentle night begins to settle in around us. The night has grown thin now, though the water around us is still dark, still quiet, and our octopus continues her slow, patient drift across the reef, unaware, as she moves, of how close morning has come. Let's use this quiet stretch to look inward once more, back toward those three small hearts of hers, and understand just how unusual they truly are, even among her own mollusk relatives. Most soft-bodied creatures like snails and clams rely on a simple, open kind of circulation, blood pooling loosely through open spaces within the body. But her blood moves instead through a closed network of vessels, contained and directed the entire way, a far more efficient system, and one that helped make possible everything else we've marveled at tonight, her speed, her intelligence, her restless, searching energy. It's a quiet inheritance, passed down from deep in her family's past, that set her apart from so many of her softer, slower cousins. Behind each of her eyes, tucked away and easy to overlook, sits a small gland that carries an outsized influence over the entire shape of her life. This is her optic gland, and it's here that a quiet hormonal signal begins, sometime after she mates, setting in motion the very changes we spoke of earlier, drawing her toward her eggs, and toward the end of her life soon after. In careful laboratory studies, researchers have found that adjusting this small gland can delay those changes considerably, allowing an octopus to live on well past her natural time. It's a strange thought to sit with, that so much of her fate rests within a structure smaller than a single pea. Let's drift back, for a moment, to the very beginning of her story, to the pale, glistening eggs we saw guarded so faithfully several hours ago. When those eggs finally hatch, most young octopuses don't sink immediately to the sea floor to begin the solitary life we've followed tonight. Instead, they rise toward the sunlit surface waters, drifting for days or even weeks as tiny, nearly transparent plankton, carried by currents far from where they were born, before finally settling down to find a hiding place of their own among the rocks and coral below. It's a strange and vulnerable stretch of her life, tiny and adrift in open water, and very few of them survive it. Of the many thousands of eggs a mother might lay, only a small handful will ever grow old enough to become the kind of quiet, capable creature we've spent this night getting to know. Even within her own body, she carries the occasional passenger. A group of small, mysterious parasites called dicyamids make their home almost nowhere else in nature except within the kidneys of an octopus, living out their entire strange, simple lives in that one quiet corner of her, neither harming her greatly nor asking anything more than shelter. Every so often, nature also produces a small surprise within her family, an octopus discovered with more than her usual 8 arms, an extra limb formed during some irregularity in early development or healing. Rare as these cases are, researchers studying them have found small, valuable clues about how her body directs the growth and shape of her own limbs, one more quiet thread connecting her story to our own understanding of healing and growth. In certain corners of the world's oceans in recent years, scientists have also noticed something else curious: sudden surges in octopus populations in places where they were once far less common, changes some believe may be tied to shifting balances among predators and prey across the wider reef. It's a small reminder that her story doesn't unfold in isolation, but is woven, quietly, into the health and rhythm of the whole ocean around her. She belongs, we might remember once more, to a wider family entirely, the cephalopods, who also include the graceful, quick-moving squid, the color-shifting cuttlefish, and her ancient, shelled cousin, the nautilus. And among all of them, most who study this family closely consider her, our own quiet, solitary guide, to be the most complex, the most curious, the most capable of surprising us, of everyone in that old and remarkable lineage. The water begins, almost imperceptibly, to lighten somewhere far above us, and our octopus, sensing the change the way she senses everything, begins to make her way back toward the quiet den where her long night began. The water above us has begun to soften into a pale, hazy gray, the very first quiet hint of morning finding its way down through the sea, and our octopus makes her way steadily back toward the small, familiar den where her night began. Before we join her there to rest, let's spend these last quiet minutes gathering a few more small, gentle truths about her, threads we haven't yet had the chance to follow. If something startles her along the way, a shadow moving too quickly, a shape appearing too close, she doesn't only reach for color or ink. Sometimes, she does something bolder still, flashing suddenly into bright, high-contrast patterns, spreading her arms wide and raising her body tall in the water, making herself, for just a moment, as large and as startling as she possibly can, before slipping away in the confusion that follows. It's called a diematic display, a last, dramatic flourish held in reserve for when subtlety alone isn't quite enough. Some of her cousins carry an even quieter trick tucked into their skin. The California two-spot octopus bears a pale, round marking near the base of one arm, shaped remarkably like a second eye, leading a confused predator to guess wrongly at which direction she might dart away, buying her one small, precious moment to escape in the opposite direction entirely. And through every color she's worn tonight, every pattern, every quiet warning, she has done it all without a single sound. She has no voice, no vocal cords, nothing at all resembling the calls or songs of so many other creatures in this ocean. Her entire language has been written in color, and posture, and touch, spoken fluently, and yet never once spoken aloud. Some of her family, living in the deep, lightless water far below any reef, have found another quiet way to communicate in the dark. Certain deep-sea species carry the ability to produce a soft glow of their own, faint bioluminescent light rising from specially adapted parts of their body, a quiet lantern carried through a world with no sunlight at all. Not every member of her family shares her modest size, either. Among the smallest is a tiny species known as the starsucker pygmy octopus, fully grown at barely the size of a pea, living out her entire small life in shallow coastal waters, a quiet reminder of just how much variety exists across those 300 different forms we spoke of earlier. And for those cousins living in the deepest, coldest water of all, thousands of meters below the surface, survival depends on a body built to withstand crushing pressure entirely unlike anything up here. With no air-filled lungs, no rigid bones, nothing at all inside her that pressure could crush or compress, she simply isn't troubled by depths that would be fatal to almost any creature built differently. It brings us back, gently, to one of the quieter mysteries we touched on earlier tonight, the question of how she senses light at all. Recent careful study suggests that beyond her two remarkable eyes, her very skin, spread all across her body, may carry its own scattered ability to sense light directly, meaning that in some soft, diffuse way, she may experience brightness and shadow not just through her eyes, but everywhere at once, her entire body quietly aware of the light around her. As she nears her den at last, it seems worth pausing on one final, quieter thought. For now, most of her 300 relatives remain reasonably stable across the world's oceans, adaptable as she is, resourceful as she is. But warming waters, and a sea slowly growing more acidic, present a slow, ongoing challenge that researchers continue to watch closely, one more thread in her long story still being written. She reaches her den at last, and settles, gathering her arms close, and if we watched her a moment longer, we might see one final display before she rests, arms raised, body drawn tall, a brief, wordless posture meant simply to say, to any who might be watching, that this is her space, quietly claimed, quietly defended. The light continues to grow, softly, somewhere far above us, and there's still more of her family's long, patient story left to tell. Let's rest here with her a while, and continue on, gently, when we're ready. High above the reef, where our sleeping octopus continues her quiet rest, the sun has fully risen now, warming the surface of the water, and somewhere further out, the soft hum of a small fishing boat drifts across the waves. It seems a fitting moment to spend a while considering just how closely her story has become tangled with our own. Down in her den, even in stillness, there's rarely a fixed sense of front or back to her body. Whichever direction she chooses to crawl in a given moment, that's simply the direction her body organizes itself around, arms trailing behind, arms leading ahead, with no single, permanent orientation the way we might think of our own forward-facing bodies. Even her hard beak, small as it seems, carries useful information within it. Researchers studying her remains have learned that the size of that beak scales closely with the size of the octopus it belonged to, letting scientists estimate her age and size from this one small, durable piece long after the rest of her soft body has gone. When she hunts across an open stretch of sand, she doesn't always need to see her prey directly. Sensitive suckers trailing just beneath the surface can detect the scent and shape of a clam or crab buried entirely out of sight, allowing her to dig with real purpose rather than simply searching at random. Up above her, on the deck of that small boat, a fisher checks a line of simple handmade lures, each one shaped and colored to resemble a small crab, a technique passed down through generations of coastal communities who've long understood exactly what might tempt her from a hiding place. In many parts of the world, she remains an important part of both local diets and local livelihoods, drawn from these same waters much as she has been for centuries. She holds a cherished place at tables far beyond just this coastline, too. Grilled gently over open flame in Mediterranean kitchens, folded into warm, savory batter as Japanese takoyaki, or served fresh and still faintly moving in certain Korean dishes, she has, in her own way, traveled the world entirely, carried along by cuisines that have valued her for a very long time. In recent years, a newer question has emerged around her place in our world, one that researchers, chefs, and ethicists alike continue to discuss carefully. Proposals for large-scale commercial octopus farming have drawn considerable debate, given how much we've come to understand about her intelligence, her curiosity, and her capacity, as we spoke of earlier, to be recognized under law as a genuinely sentient creature. It remains an active and unresolved conversation, weighing economic interest against a growing sense of what she may truly experience. Even setting questions of ethics aside, those who've attempted to farm her at scale have run into simple, practical difficulties. She requires live prey to hunt and thrive, and given the opportunity, may turn to a neighboring octopus rather than the food intended for her, complications that have made her a stubbornly difficult candidate for traditional aquaculture, regardless of how the wider debate is ultimately settled. It wasn't always this way between us and her. In parts of the Pacific Northwest, decades ago, a strange tradition briefly took hold: competitive octopus wrestling, divers grappling by hand with large octopuses pulled from the cold, rocky shallows, more spectacle than science. It faded from practice as the decades passed, quietly set aside as our understanding of her, and our regard for her, continued to grow into something gentler than it once was. The little fishing boat drifts on past the reef, and beneath it, our octopus sleeps on, entirely undisturbed, safe within her den for now, as the day continues on above her. Evening begins to settle over the reef once more, the light softening from gold back toward blue, and our octopus stirs gently in her den, sensing, as she always does, the quiet turning of the day. While she gathers herself, let's spend a few more minutes exploring some of the quieter signals she reads from the world around her, senses easy to overlook, tucked beneath everything louder and more colorful we've already discussed tonight. Along her arms, beyond taste and touch, she carries a subtle sensitivity to the gentle vibrations that travel through water, the distant flick of a fish's tail, the faint pulse of another creature moving nearby. It isn't hearing in the way we'd recognize it, but a kind of quiet, whole-body awareness, letting her sense movement in the dark long before she could ever see it directly. She also holds within her a delicate sensitivity to the very chemistry of the water itself, subtle shifts in salinity or oxygen level that might signal a storm building somewhere above, or a change in the tide about to turn. Long before we ever needed instruments to measure such things, creatures like her were already quietly reading them, moment to moment, through nothing more than the water flowing gently across her skin. It's this same sensitivity that may guide her, some researchers believe, when she chooses to leave one den behind for another, following some faint, hard-to-name shift in her surroundings that tells her it's simply time to move on. Watch her now as she eases out from beneath her stone, testing the current with one outstretched arm before committing her whole body to the open water. There's a careful, unhurried quality to how she begins each evening, nothing rushed, nothing wasted, a small ritual of readiness before the work of hunting begins again. Nearby, a cleaner shrimp waits patiently near a crevice in the reef, and as she passes close, she pauses, allowing the small shrimp to pick gently at her skin, clearing away tiny parasites and debris gathered over her day of rest. It's a small, mutual kindness the reef offers her, a moment of trust extended toward a creature far smaller and far less dangerous than the predators she must otherwise watch for constantly. Even a creature as solitary as she is, it seems, still finds occasional room for a little quiet cooperation, when the terms are simple and the benefit is shared. As the last of the daylight fades entirely from the water above, she moves on into the gathering dark, arms trailing softly behind her, ready once more for whatever the night ahead might bring. The reef settles into darkness once more, and our octopus begins her second night of hunting, moving with the same quiet confidence we watched build across the whole of the night before. Let's use this fresh stretch of darkness to gather a handful more small truths about her, details that haven't yet found their place in her story. Watch closely as she passes over a stretch of open sand, and you'll notice her body seems to flow rather than walk, each arm placed with a kind of loose, independent judgment, and yet the whole of her moving forward with real, unified purpose. Researchers who study her movement describe this as a kind of decentralized coordination, her many small minds somehow agreeing, moment to moment, on a single shared direction, without any one part of her needing to issue the order. It's worth remembering, too, that for all her intelligence, she has no real capacity to teach her young directly. Since most mothers, as we learned earlier, don't survive long after their eggs hatch, each new octopus begins life with no guidance at all, no parent to learn from, relying entirely on instinct and her own trial and error to discover, quite alone, everything she'll ever need to know about surviving in this ocean. It makes everything she manages to learn across her short life feel a little more remarkable still, an entire education completed with no teacher, no lineage of passed-down knowledge, only her own quiet persistence. As she pauses near a small outcrop of rock, we might notice, too, how differently she experiences temperature compared to us. Being what scientists call an ectotherm, her own body temperature rises and falls along with the water around her, rather than being held steady the way our own bodies work to maintain. It shapes everything about her, how quickly she moves, how quickly she thinks, tied closely to whatever temperature the sea happens to be tonight. In warmer water, she often moves a little faster, hunts a little more actively, while in colder water, everything about her, her pace, her appetite, her very metabolism, slows to match the chill around her. Ahead, in a wide, open stretch of the reef, she encounters the pale, ghostly shape of a jellyfish drifting past, and gives it wide, careful berth, unwilling to risk its trailing, stinging tentacles despite her usual boldness elsewhere. Even a creature so capable of defending herself knows precisely which dangers are worth avoiding altogether, rather than confronting. She continues on, arms trailing gently behind her, disappearing once more into the soft, familiar dark of her second night among the reef. Our octopus continues her steady drift across the reef, and the water around her carries the particular hush of a night now fully settled into its rhythm. Let's spend this stretch considering her memory a little more closely, since it's one of the quieter marvels we've only briefly touched on tonight. Careful study has shown that she holds both a short-term memory, useful for the immediate task in front of her, and a longer-term memory besides, capable of retaining a learned skill or a solved puzzle for days, even weeks, after she first encountered it, a structure surprisingly similar in its basic shape to the way memory works in creatures far more closely related to us than to her. It raises a small, quiet wonder, that two such different branches of life, one with a backbone and one without, might have each found their own separate way toward something so similar in function, if not in form. She pauses now near a familiar bend in the reef, and something in her manner suggests recognition, a returning to ground she's crossed before rather than an entirely new discovery. Some researchers believe she may hold a kind of simple mental map of her home range, built from repeated visits, letting her navigate familiar territory with more confidence than a stranger to these waters ever could. As she moves on, we might also mention a detail about her that's easy to overlook amid everything grander we've covered tonight. She has no ears in any form we'd recognize, and yet the whole surface of her skin appears to carry some faint capacity to register the pressure changes of sound moving through water, particularly at lower frequencies, closer to a felt vibration than anything resembling true hearing. It means the world reaches her not through any single sense the way it might reach us, but through many quiet, overlapping ones at once, taste and touch and pressure and color all woven together into a single, continuous impression of everything around her. Further along, in a shallow depression in the sand, she comes across the abandoned shell of a hermit crab's former home, and pauses to investigate it thoroughly, turning it over with two careful arms before finally moving on. It's a small moment of simple curiosity, examining something new for no particular reason beyond her own quiet interest in the world she moves through. The current shifts gently around her, and she continues on, carrying all of this quiet, led awareness forward with her into the darker water ahead. The reef opens into a wider, quieter stretch of water, scattered with low coral formations, and our octopus moves through it with the easy familiarity of a creature well settled into her own small territory. It's worth pausing here to understand just how modest that territory usually is. Most octopuses, for all the wide, roaming curiosity we've followed tonight, actually keep to a surprisingly small home range, often no larger than a few dozen square meters of reef, a single den and its immediate surroundings serving as the entire known world for the whole of her short life. Within that small kingdom, she tends to recognize and return to a handful of favored spots, this crevice for resting, that patch of open sand for hunting, learned and revisited across the week she spends there, rather than wandering endlessly into unfamiliar ground each night. When she does eventually leave one den for another, it's rarely sudden. Researchers have observed that she often relocates gradually, exploring a new potential shelter for several nights running before finally committing to it fully, carrying her few belongings, empty shells, favorite hiding stones, from the old den to the new one in patient, unhurried stages. It's a strangely tender detail, that even a creature so briefly lived takes the trouble to move house with such quiet care. She passes now through a stretch of reef claimed by another of her kind, and the two octopuses hold a brief, wary distance from one another, neither approaching further than necessary. Encounters like this rarely turn to actual conflict. More often, a simple raising of arms, a brief darkening of color, is enough to communicate the boundary, and both will drift on their separate ways, territory respected without needing to be defended by force. It's a quiet, practical diplomacy, conducted entirely without words, between two creatures who share this reef but have little other need of each other's company. As she continues past the boundary and back into her own familiar ground, the reef settles once more into its steady, nighttime hush around her. Beyond the edge of our octopus's small, familiar territory, the reef gives way to open water, and it seems a fitting moment to drift a little further out, considering some of her relatives who've made their homes in far stranger corners of the world's oceans. In the icy waters beneath Antarctic sea ice, a small, hardy species known as the turquoise octopus makes a home in conditions that would overwhelm nearly any other creature, water so cold it hovers barely above freezing, her whole slow metabolism adjusted to match a life lived entirely within that narrow, frigid range. Elsewhere, along the rocky shorelines of the Pacific, the East Pacific red octopus makes a home in the shallow tide pools and kelp forests of the coast, rarely growing larger than a dinner plate, and yet remarkably common, one of the most frequently encountered octopuses by divers and tide poolers exploring those particular waters. Further out, in the open blue far from any coastline at all, some species have given up the reef entirely, drifting instead through the vast middle layers of the ocean, neither near the surface nor close to the seafloor, a strange, weightless kind of life lived permanently in transit, never quite settling anywhere for long. It's worth remembering, too, that her family's reach extends to nearly every temperature and depth the ocean has to offer, from the shallow, sun-warmed tide pools where children might find one hiding beneath a rock, down through the reef, into the open blue water, and further still, into trenches so deep and dark that sunlight has never once touched them. Wherever she happens to live, though, certain things about her remain remarkably constant. The same soft, boneless body. The same searching intelligence. The same solitary preference for her own quiet company. It's as if her family discovered, very early in their long history, a shape and a way of living so effective that it simply needed to be carried forward, adjusted here and there, into whatever corner of the ocean each new generation happened to find itself in. Our own octopus, tucked safely within her own small patch of reef, carries forward that same long, patient inheritance tonight, one small link in a chain that stretches back further than we can easily imagine. Our octopus settles for a moment along a quiet stretch of the reef, and it seems a fitting time to return, once more, to her body itself, and gather a few last remaining details that scientists have only recently begun to understand. Her genome, the full genetic blueprint carried within every one of her cells, turns out to be considerably larger and more complex than researchers first expected, containing far more genes than our own human genome holds, many of them entirely unique to her family, having no clear equivalent anywhere else in the animal kingdom. It's one part of why she remains such a source of fascination in modern genetics, a body built from instructions unlike almost anything else alive. Among those unique genes are a striking number related directly to her nervous system, an unusually large family of genes thought to help support the sheer complexity of her many small, distributed minds, a genetic foundation matching the strange, decentralized intelligence we've marveled at all throughout tonight. Her skin, too, holds one final genetic secret worth mentioning. Those light-sensitive opsins we spoke of earlier, scattered across her body beyond her eyes, appear to be encoded by genes very similar to the ones that build the light-sensing cells within her actual eyes, suggesting her whole body may share a kind of common genetic thread for sensing light, one unified toolkit, used in more places than we ever expected. Even her wound healing carries its own quiet wonder. Beyond simply regrowing a lost arm, her body appears capable of healing injuries with remarkable speed and minimal scarring, a soft, resilient kind of repair that researchers studying regenerative medicine continue to study closely, hoping to learn something from her that might, one day, help mend injuries in creatures built quite differently than she is. It's a strange thought to sit with, that so much of what makes her seem so wonderfully alien to us might, in time, become part of how we come to understand and heal our own far more ordinary bodies. She stirs again, drawing her arms in close before continuing on, carrying all of that quiet, complicated biology forward with her, entirely unaware of just how closely we've been studying the very question of what makes her, her. Another day passes quietly for our octopus, spent resting in the safety of her den, and now, as the water darkens once more, she begins her third night among the reef, moving with the same soft, unhurried confidence that's carried her through every night we've followed so far. Let's spend this stretch on a handful of gentler, quieter details, the kind easy to miss amid everything grander we've already covered. Watch her drifting near a patch of soft, swaying sea grass, and notice how naturally her arms curl and uncurl as she moves, never quite still, always exploring some small edge of the world around her, even when nothing in particular seems to be happening at all. It's simply her nature, a body built for constant, gentle inquiry. She pauses near a small cluster of barnacles, and reaches to taste one gently, deciding, after a moment, that it isn't worth the effort of prying loose, moving on instead toward more promising ground. Even her curiosity, endless as it seems, is guided by a quiet, practical sense of where her limited time and energy are best spent. Above her, a soft veil of bioluminescent plankton drifts past, tiny points of pale blue-green light scattered like stars fallen into the water, stirred to brief brightness by the gentle current. She pays them little mind, accustomed to this quiet, glowing companionship that visits the reef most nights, one more small wonder woven into the ordinary fabric of her world. Further along, she passes close to a sleeping parrotfish, wrapped for the night in a thin, protective cocoon of its own mucus, a strange and delicate defense unrelated to anything in her own toolkit, and yet, in its own way, just one more example of how many different quiet strategies this reef holds for simply making it safely through until morning. She continues on, unhurried, through the soft, glowing dark, carrying her own particular strategy forward, one slow, careful arm at a time. The reef around our octopus grows quieter still as the night deepens, and she moves through it now with the calm, practiced ease of a creature fully at home in her small corner of the sea. Let's spend a little of this quiet time considering how she experiences stress and calm, since even a creature so different from us shares at least some quiet echo of both. When startled or threatened, her body responds with a rush of hormones not unlike our own, heightening her alertness, quickening her reactions, before gradually settling again once the danger has passed. It's a reminder that the line between her experience and ours may be thinner, in certain quiet ways, than her strange and unfamiliar body might first suggest. She rests now beside a slow-moving sea cucumber, its long, soft body sifting patiently through the sand nearby, and the two share the same small patch of reef without the slightest concern for one another, entirely different creatures, entirely different lives, simply coexisting within the same quiet stretch of water. Nearby, a small cleaner wrasse darts past, tending to a larger fish waiting patiently at what researchers sometimes call a cleaning station, and our octopus drifts past this small, cooperative scene without pause, her own needs and her own rhythms entirely separate from theirs tonight. It's worth remembering, watching her move so easily among so many other lives, that the reef itself functions rather like a small city, each creature keeping to its own particular routine, its own particular needs, and yet all of them woven together into the same shared, breathing whole. She is one small citizen among many, her story only one thread among countless others unfolding, quietly, all around her, every single night. As she rounds a familiar bend in the coral, the current shifts gently, carrying the scent of open water from somewhere further out, and she pauses for a moment, considering it, before continuing on into the familiar dark of her own small home. Our octopus continues her slow journey through the reef, and we find ourselves, tonight, gathering some of the last remaining threads of her long, quiet story. She has, we might remember once more, no fixed lifespan carved in stone the way ours tends to be. Some smaller species live barely 6 months from hatching to the end of their days, while others, like the giant Pacific octopus we met several nights ago, may live 3 or 4 years, an entire life, however it unfolds, compressed into a span most of us would consider barely a beginning. And yet, within that short span, she manages so much. She learns. She remembers. She solves problems set before her by curious researchers, and problems the reef itself sets before her every single night. She builds and rebuilds her home as circumstances shift around her. She raises, in her own final act, an entire new generation, before her own quiet story reaches its end. It's worth sitting with the thought that intelligence, in her case, was never really about planning for some distant future. She has no need for one. Instead, her whole remarkable mind seems built entirely for the present, for solving whatever the current moment happens to demand of her, fully and completely, without the burden of dwelling on what came before or what still lies ahead. Perhaps there's something quietly worth learning from that, watching her drift so calmly through her brief, attentive life. Not worry for tomorrow. Not grief for yesterday. Only this reef, this current, this particular stretch of dark water, met fully, with whatever curiosity and care she has to offer it. She pauses now, near the entrance to a den much like the one where her own story began, resting for a moment in the soft, familiar dark, entirely present, entirely here. The night has grown very calm now, the reef settling into that particular deep stillness that comes only in its quietest hours, and our octopus moves through it slowly, her long night's work nearly done. Let's gather these last few gentle details as she makes her way, finally, back toward rest. She pauses near a bed of soft coral, swaying almost imperceptibly in the Bel Air current, and for a moment, simply seems to watch it, still and attentive, in no particular hurry to move on. Somewhere far above, the moon has risen fully now, its pale light barely reaching this depth, softened and scattered long before it ever touches the reef floor, and yet, faintly, she seems to sense even this, some small shift in the quality of the dark around her. She passes a small clutch of sea anemones closing gently for the night, their delicate tentacles drawing inward, and gives them the same wide, careful berth she always does, old caution on it out of habit rather than any immediate need. Nearby, a school of small silverfish drifts past, moving as one great, shimmering shape, and she watches them go without any particular interest, her hunting already finished for the night, her attention now turning simply toward home. It's a strange thing, watching a creature so capable of drama, ink and camouflage and startling display, moving now with such plain, unremarkable calm, simply making her way home the way any tired creature might, at the end of any ordinary night. She reaches the entrance of her den at last, and eases herself inside, arms drawing close around her, settling into the soft, familiar dark, ready to rest once more before the reef, and her story, continue on. Our octopus rests now, fully, in the quiet dark of her den, and here, at last, we come to the close of this long, gentle journey we've shared with her. Let's spend these final minutes simply looking back over everything we've gathered, not as a list to remember, but as a single, quiet portrait of a creature who has turned out to be so much more than she first appeared. 3 hearts, and blood touched with blue. 9 small minds, working together as one. A body without a single bone to hold her back, and a mind capable of memory, of patience, of something that might, in its own quiet way, resemble wonder. She has shown us color used as language, camouflage used as art, and intelligence carried not in some single, central place, but spread gently through every reaching arm. She has shown us solitude, and brief, careful partnership. Fierce independence, and one final, selfless act of care. A life lived fully, however briefly, without ever once needing more time than she was given. She belongs to an ancient family, far older than almost anything else swimming in this ocean tonight, and yet she carries that whole long history so lightly, so quietly, content simply to rest here in this small, familiar den, one soft and remarkable thread in the much larger, ever-unfolding story of the sea. As we leave her now, resting peacefully in the dark, perhaps we might carry a little of her quiet wisdom back up with us, out of this water, into whatever rest awaits us too. A little more curiosity toward the small, unfamiliar things we encounter. A little more patience for the slow, careful work of learning something new. A little more willingness to simply be present, fully, in whatever quiet moment we happen to find ourselves in. The reef settles into its final, deep stillness, and our octopus sleeps on, safe and unhurried, exactly where she belongs. Good night.